The vibration on the nightstand started at exactly 3 a.m., cutting through the silence of the penthouse like a jagged blade through velvet. Robert Clark didn't hesitate as his hand closed around the device. In the violent hierarchy of the Korean underworld, a man like Robert, an enforcer defined by the colorful, lethal dragons winding up his neck, knew that the early hours were reserved for either death or betrayal. Fear was a sensation he had surgically removed from his soul years ago. He was the Great Wall of the Seoul syndicate, a shadow whose reputation for cold efficiency preceded him from the neon alleys of Itaewon to the high-stakes boardrooms of Gangnam. But the voice that filtered through the speaker wasn't a subordinate delivering a status report on a hit. It was a frantic, desperate whisper that caused the cold ink on his skin to feel suddenly like ice. "Is this Robert, please? It's Jane. She's at Seoul General." The voice cracked with a terror Robert hadn't felt in a lifetime. "They don't think she's going to make it through the hour. Robert, she's calling for you." 2 years ago, he had let Jane Park walk away, forcing a bitter separation to protect her from the very monster he had become. He had watched the only person who saw the man beneath the tattoos disappear into a life of safety. Now, that safety had shattered, dragging him back from the icy abyss of his own making. Robert was already moving, his hands reaching for his keys and the Glock on the nightstand. The dragon on his skin seemed to pulse in the dim light as he realized his past hadn't just caught up to him, it was dying. The Merced skidded to a halt beneath the sterile overhang of Seoul General's emergency entrance, the engine still ticking with the heat of the chase. Robert didn't wait for the valet. He moved through the sliding glass doors with a predatory grace that made the night staff recoil. His expensive suit was discarded in a blur of motion as he bypassed security, his presence alone acting as a master key. Within minutes, he had forced his way into the surgical wing, trading his silk blazer for the anonymity of blue scrubs and a paper mask. But the mask couldn't hide the intensity in his eyes, the focused, dark gaze of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating the border between life and death. The operating room was a landscape of cold blues and harsh, overhead lights that bleached the color from the world. In the center of the mechanical chaos lay Jane, her breathing shallow, her vibrant spirit dimmed by the trauma of the night. Robert ignored the protests of the lead surgeon and the frantic beeping of the monitors. He moved to the head of the table, his large, calloused hands, the same hands that bore the intricate, colorful ink of the underworld, reaching out to find hers. When their fingers locked, the sterile room seemed to shrink until only the two of them remained. Jane's eyes fluttered open, tracking upward with a mixture of terror and profound relief as she recognized the man standing over her. Robert leaned in close, his posture a bridge between the clinical coldness of the hospital and the raw heat of his devotion. He gripped her hand with a crushing, desperate strength, his thumb tracing over her knuckles in a silent promise. The dragon tattoos on his arms, partially visible beneath the short sleeves of his scrubs, served as a grim reminder of the world he had left outside those doors. He wasn't just holding her hand, he was anchoring her to the earth, refusing to let the abyss take the only person who had ever made him feel human. "I'm here, Jane," his gaze whispered, more powerful than any spoken word. "And I am never letting go." The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the steady, artificial pulse of the heart monitor became the soundtrack to Robert's haunting memories as he sat by Jane, bedside. In the silence of the recovery room, the sharp scent of antiseptic pulled him back to the night their world had first fractured. 2 years ago, in a penthouse that felt more like a fortress than a home. He remembered the way the moonlight had hit Jane's face, mirrored in her eyes as she looked at the blood on his knuckles, a silent testament to a negotiation that had turned lethal. It wasn't the violence that had broken them, but the realization that his life as the Shadow King was a terminal disease, one that would eventually consume everyone he touched. The dragon on his neck had felt like a lead weight back then, a brand that marked him as property of the syndicate. He could still hear her voice, trembling but resolute, telling him that she couldn't wake up every morning wondering if the man beside her was a husband or a target. Robert had watched her pack her life into 2 suitcases, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He hadn't fought for her. He had let her go because his love was the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal. To keep her, he would have had to kill for her, and he knew that every life he took only pushed her further away. Now, looking at her pale hand beneath his, the cost of his empire felt staggering. He had built a throne out of fear and silence, only to find himself a king in a kingdom of ghosts. Every flickering light in the hallway and every distant footstep reminded him that the shadow code didn't allow for retirement. He had spent 700 days pretending that the ink on his skin was his only identity, but the way Jane's fingers instinctively curled toward his palm, even in her sleep, proved that some bonds couldn't be severed by a signature or a threat. The business was unfinished because he had never truly left her, and the syndicate had never truly let him go. As the shadows lengthened against the sterile hospital walls, Robert realized that being a king meant nothing if he couldn't protect the only person who saw the man behind the mask. The stillness of the recovery room was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, heavy death of the light. 1 second, the ward was bathed in the artificial, sterile glow of hospital fluorescent. The next, a suffocating velvet darkness swallowed the floor. The steady, rhythmic hum of the life support machines cut out, replaced by the eerie, high-pitched whine of battery backups kicking in. Robert didn't need to see the red emergency lights flickering to life in the hallway to know what had happened. Sang-hoon hadn't just tripped a breaker, he had severed the hospital's nervous system. Robert's grip on Jane's hand tightened, his thumb pressing firmly against her skin as he leaned over her, his body becoming a physical shield in the gloom. The intense focus in his eyes sharpened, his pupils dilating to hunt in the shadows. He could hear the distant, muffled chaos of the nursing station, the panicked whispers of staff, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of steel security doors slamming shut as the building's automated lockdown engaged. But through the medical cacophony, his ears picked up a different sound. The synchronized, heavy footfalls of men who didn't belong in a place of healing. Tactical boots on linoleum. The metallic click of safeties being disengaged. Sang-hoon had turned the sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. The colorful dragons on Robert's arms seemed to writhe in the pulsing red emergency light, a silent call to the violence he had tried to leave behind. He looked down at Jane, whose face was a mask of pale vulnerability against the pillows, her eyes searching his for a reassurance he wasn't sure he could provide. He was no longer a man in a hospital. He was a predator trapped in a cage with his most precious possession. The Shadow King was back, and as the first kick hit the double doors at the end of the hall, Robert realized he would have to turn this sterile ward into a graveyard to keep the dawn from being her last. When Robert re-entered the room, the scent of copper followed him, masked only slightly by the biting smell of hospital-grade disinfectant. He sat back in the chair, his posture once again leaning toward the bed in that protective, singular vigil, his gloved hand reaching out to reclaim Jane's with a desperation that bordered on prayer. The color was beginning to return to her cheeks, a stark contrast to the pale blue of his surgical mask and the sterile sheets. When her eyelids finally flickered, her gaze drifted upward, clouded by the haze of anesthesia until it locked onto his dark, intense eyes. For a moment, the world of sirens and shadows outside didn't exist. There was only the grounding pressure of his grip and the rhythmic beep of her heart on the monitor. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that barely carried across the quiet room. Robert leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers as he maintained a gaze that promised more than safety. It promised an end to the lies. He watched her with an unwavering focus, his expression a complicated map of relief and a resolve that had been forged in the blood he had just spilled in the hall. The colorful dragons on his neck, visible above the collar of his scrubs, felt like the skin of a man he no longer wanted to be. He had spent years as the Great Wall, built to withstand every assault, but Jane was the only one who had ever made it past the fortifications. "I'm done, Jane," he murmured, the words heavy with a truth that shook the very foundation of his underworld legacy. He didn't look at the door where he had just ended a life. He looked only at her. He told her about the secrets he held, the leverage that would buy their disappearance, and the legitimate life he had quietly been building in the shadows of his own empire. He was ready to trade his throne for a chance to wake up without blood on his hands, to let the ink on his skin become nothing more than a memory of a man who had died so they could finally live. As her fingers tightened around his in understanding, the dragon finally found peace in the one place he had always belonged. The transition from the rooftop was silent, a descent from the heights of violence back into the sterile, humming quiet of the recovery ward. Robert sat in the same vinyl chair, the morning light now filtering through the blinds and catching the intricate, colorful scales of the dragons on his neck, a legacy he was currently signing away with a steady hand. Spread across the small bedside table were documents that had no business being in a hospital: transfer of assets, blind trust agreements, and the 2 forged death certificates that would be the final price of his freedom. He looked at Jane, her face finally peaceful in sleep, her hand still resting within reach of his own. The Great Wall was dismantling itself brick by brick. By signing the ransom of his soul, he was handing the keys to the kingdom to men like Sang-hoon, trading the glitter of Gangnam and the shadows of Incheon for the chance to be a ghost. His intense, focused gaze never wavered as he initialed the final page, effectively erasing Robert Clark from the Underworld's ledger. He wasn't just buying safety, he was buying a vacuum where his past used to be. The surgical mask he still wore felt less like a disguise now, and more like a bridge to the new life he was claiming. A life defined by healing rather than the scars he had spent decades accumulating. He reached out and took Jane's hand again, his thumb tracing the soft skin of her knuckles with a gentleness that felt brand new. The colorful ink on his skin seemed to dim as the paperwork was tucked away, replaced by the weightless reality of a man with nothing left but the person in front of him. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest on the monitors. The syndicate thought they were taking his empire, but as he watched Jane's eyes begin to flutter open in the soft dawn, Robert knew he had cheated them all. He had traded a throne of blood for a lifetime of silence, and for the first time in his life, the Shadow King felt like a wealthy man. The digital clock on the bedside table flicked to 3:01 a.m., but the silence that followed was no longer a precursor to violence. In this new country, where the air smelled of salt and cedar instead of Seoul's diesel and neon, the early hours were just a quiet interval in a life reclaimed. Robert sat up slowly, his gaze drifting to Jane, who was sleeping deeply beside him, her breathing as steady and peaceful as it had been during her long recovery. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar terrain of her knuckles, a gesture that had once been a desperate anchor in an operating room and was now a simple, daily habit of love. The moon cast a soft, silver light over his shoulder, revealing the ghost of the dragons that had once defined him. The vibrant reds and deep, lethal greens of the ink were now muted, broken by the pale lines of laser removal that mirrored the sterile, healing light of the hospital where their second chance began. The Great Wall had been dismantled, and the skin beneath was sensitive and new, much like the man himself. He no longer wore a mask to hide his face or a suit to project authority. He wore the simple, worn cotton of a man who worked with his hands in the light of day. His eyes, once perpetually sharpened for a threat, were now soft with a singular focus on the woman beside him. The syndicate, Sang-hoon, and the blood-soaked throne of the Underworld felt like a story told about someone else, a man who had died exactly 1 year ago. As Jane stirred and pulled his hand closer to her heart, Robert realized that the 3:00 a.m. that used to shake his world had finally been silenced. The ink was fading, the scars were closing, and for the first time in his life, the silence of the night didn't feel like a trap, it felt like home. This concludes the journey of Robert and Jane. Would you like me to generate a final cinematic image of them in this new setting to close the story?